All right. Well, good afternoon and welcome to the World Affairs Council Washington, D.C.'s Global Education Program on Understanding the Conflict in Gaza. This is part of our monthly webinar series, which offers students, teachers, and the public important information on a timely global issue by having direct access to experts and to ask the questions you want. If you are interested in learning more about our programs and to receive our weekly updates, please visit our website and join our outreach list. You can join the conversation today or follow our programs on Twitter. Our handle is at WAC_DC. Before I introduce Dr. Shibley Telhami, our speaker for the afternoon, I would like to let everyone know that following his remarks, we will be opening up for questions, which you can send through the chat function on your screen or via Twitter. Please make sure to state your name and where you are from. We will do our best to answer all of the questions before the end of the program. In July, tensions flared between Israel and Gaza when 3 Israeli teens were kidnapped. This fueled reactions by both sides that led to a several-week war. A ceasefire has been reached for the time being, thanks in large part to Egypt. Both sides claim victory, however, the fact remains that thousands of civilians were either killed or badly injured in the conflict, homes were destroyed, and lives uprooted. Going forward, several questions remain, some of which are, will the ceasefire hold? Will the Israeli and the Palestinians be able to reach any agreements? And what will happen with the reconstruction that is desperately needed for the civilians in Gaza? Speaking with us today is Dr. Shibley Telhami. He is the Anwar Sadat Professor for Peace and Development at the University of Maryland in College Park and a non-resident fellow of the Saban Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institution. He has served as advisor to the U.S. mission to the UN, as advisor to former Congressman Lee Hamilton, and more recently as senior advisor to George Mitchell, President Obama's United States Special Envoy to the Middle East Peace, and as a member of the U.S. delegation to the trilateral U.S.-Israeli-Palestinian Anti-Incitement Committee, which was mandated by the Wye River Agreements and has served as an advisor to the United States Department of State. He also serves on the Iraq Study Group as a member of the Strategic Environment Working Group. He has contributed to the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Los Angeles Times, and regularly appears on national and international radio and television, and has written several books. Thank you for being here with us this afternoon, and please bear with us for a brief moment while we switch the cameras on the computers.
Great. Well, thanks so much for hosting me. And what I'd like to do is just spend a few minutes to put the recent Gaza conflict in perspective and talk about the humanitarian tragedy as well that has emerged, and offer some reflections on where we are at this point. I know that some of you may have a strong background in this, some may not. So I would like to start really to giving you a background to when this conflict started and why, meaning the recent Gaza war. I think a lot of people think that this war, which has been tragic and we've seen the horrific impact of it, is the source of the problem that's complicating peacemaking. In fact, that is an incorrect assumption. I think certainly war is complicated, and this one has as well. But the reality of it is the problem was there prior to the war. In fact, I happened to be in the region when the initial kidnappings took place. Initially, 3 Israeli teenagers were kidnapped and killed, and then a Palestinian was kidnapped out of East Jerusalem and burned to death. And those clearly created an environment that was very, very painful to watch and also on a humanitarian level, and drove the politics of both parties. And in fact, I happen to think I'm one of the people who believe that neither the Israeli government nor Hamas intended to escalate to the level that they did escalate, and they essentially found themselves entangled in an escalation game that no one really necessarily wanted. But even before this, I was there having concluded that it was only a matter of time before we were going to have an eruption. Yes, the kidnappings had something to do with the political environment that mobilized people, but the reality of it is there was a level of despair, particularly in the West Bank and Gaza, after the collapse of the American negotiations, the efforts to bring about a two-state solution. And we saw this in the polls. I conduct polls in the Palestinian area as well as Israel. And you have a majority of Israelis, a majority of Palestinians who no longer believe the two-state solution is possible. And so the very basic aim of the negotiation, which is to assure two states, is no longer even believed by the public. And frankly, when you look at the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, they had been under occupation since 1967, and despite the rounds of diplomacy and hope mixed with rounds of violence and confrontation, they've gotten nowhere near having an independent state of their own. And while Gaza and the West Bank are both under legal occupation in terms of who is the sovereign really responsible for what happens there since 1967, the situation in Gaza and the West Bank differ dramatically, not only economically, but also politically. Certainly, in terms of who governs, the Palestinians, unfortunately, have been divided between Hamas, which governs in Gaza, and the West Bank is governed by the Palestinian Authority, mostly led by Fatah, which is the faction of President Mahmoud Abbas. They have recently, just before the war, they had actually formed a national unity government that has not been fully implemented. They still struggle with it, but at least they moved in that direction prior to the war, and that has in some ways led to a certain level of cooperation during the war. But Gaza has faced horrific conditions, in large part because despite the withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza, in fact, Gaza has very little outlet to the outside world, has been under imposed sanctions with minimal amount of goods and food getting in. And a lot of the international humanitarian organizations have been warning of an impending disaster in Gaza even prior to the war. And you can imagine that now after the war, if you think that day one of the war, Gaza starts with a horrific situation where people are calling for some urgent need to alleviate the suffering, both economically and politically, for Gazans. Imagine what has happened since the war, where aside from the many people who were killed, and we'll come back to that, you had an economic disaster on the scale of probably around 3 times the GDP of Gaza, possibly up to $9 billion in a very small economy that is highly dependent on the outside world. So even to get back to where they were, that horrific condition that I was talking about, it might require a large-scale foreign aid package. It's hard to imagine in this environment internationally. And some people actually, some UN organization estimate it might take 30 years to build up to where it was at that very bad starting point. So that's what we're talking about in terms of scale. Regardless of the tragedy that happened in July, you can actually look back and see how a lot of analysts were saying we might be upon a third intifada, meaning a new Palestinian uprising because of the absence of a political move, the absence of hope of people getting out of it. The Israelis clearly were in a better situation, even though they too were growing hopeless about the prospect of a two-state solution. I'm talking about the Israeli public as we see in the polling, but there was no apparent urgency on the Israeli side. The Israelis had managed in some ways to buffer themselves economically from what was happening in the West Bank, and even politically. And in fact, I was meeting with a prominent Israeli journalist who was making the point, while I was there, that prior to the kidnappings, was making the point that the Israeli public doesn't even, feel any urgency, whether it's with regard to the West Bank or Gaza. And obviously, that changed very dramatically with the onset of the war. So I wanted to give this background to understand that the war itself wasn't the problem per se. Obviously, it adds the complication. There was a very difficult political environment that was explosive. And it was only a matter of time, and it would have just taken, if it weren't the kidnappings, it was going to be something else that would drag people into it. So that's number one. Number two, I think that if you look at the recent Gaza war, and it was intense, it was reminiscent in some ways of the 2006 Israel-Lebanon war vis-a-vis Hezbollah. In the sense of maybe perhaps both parties thought they would have to fight each other at some point, but neither was really looking to have that fighting take place and escalate in that summer, and both underestimated the other in terms of what they can do. And I think what we have seen is surprising results in some ways from the Israeli point of view, and perhaps from the Palestinian point of view, but more from the Israeli point of view. There's no doubt when you look at that Gaza war, you're talking about, and we call it a war, but the reality of it is it's highly asymmetrical. You're talking about Israel having one of the most effective armies in the world, extremely technologically advanced, very effective Air Force, the best technology you can get in the world, and a lot of resources. And you're talking about an area, a very small geographic area, which is one of the most densely occupied areas in the world. 1.8 million people who don't really have much access to the world. Per capita income is very low. GDP is probably around, estimated, perhaps $1.7 billion, no more. And clearly, you're talking about Hamas as a militant group with a limited access to the outside world with relative rudimentary weaponry, and that is obviously rockets, and sometimes rockets that don't have explosive, just shooting tubes across the distance. They manage, nonetheless, to certainly undermine Israeli sense of safety and stability, because they clearly were able to shoot roughly 100 rockets a day for the duration of the conflict, even after intensive Israeli bombings, which didn't inflict a lot of damage and casualties in relative terms, but it did create a different psychology, uncertainty, and certainly insecurity for a lot of Israeli people. But there's no question the damage, the bulk of damage was on the Palestinian side. And we look at it, it's horrific damage. And as usual, civilians are the biggest casualty. So when you see the UN estimates are that over 70% of the people who were killed and injured were civilians. Several hundreds were children. We're talking about over 1,400 dead, about 12,000 wounded. That's roughly 0.7% of all of the Gaza population. We're talking about the damage of to about over 40,000 homes, roughly representing 13% of all housing stock in Gaza, including some apartment high-rises that were leveled just on the last couple of days of the war. We're talking about internally displaced during the war up to 500,000 people, roughly close to 30% of the population, and even now over 100,000 people, mostly provided for by UNRWA. You're talking about still even today, nearly 500,000 people who don't have access to clean water. So the damage has been extraordinary on a scale that if you multiply it, if you just looked at it in the context of a larger population to be driven home, you have to put in the context of 1.8 million population. So you've had tremendous damage that happened. And you had obviously a lot of a reaction from the international community, but remarkably in the region, the reaction was not as high as one would have expected, given how much people typically care about the question of Palestine and Israel-Palestine, and that's in large part because the Arab world itself was preoccupied with all of the changes that have taken place, whether it's the tragedy in Syria or in Iraq or in Yemen or Libya, and even Egypt, which has a stake in what happens in Gaza, found itself caught between, on the one hand, wanting to support the Palestinians, on the one hand, the Egyptian leadership looking at Hamas in Gaza as the enemy because they're ally of their own domestic enemy, the Muslim Brotherhood. And so it was very complicated, and the U.S. found itself, not having the influence with the parties to generate the kind of outcome the U.S. wanted to have from the beginning, and it found itself competing with alliances in the region. On the one hand, Egypt and Saudi Arabia somewhat cooperating with the Israelis. On the other hand, you have the Qataris and the Turks who were weighing in a little bit in favor of Hamas. So you have this polarization in the region. The U.S. found itself caught in the middle of it. So what happened now that the fighting has ended? First, we can go over the tragedy, and I welcome questions in terms of the humanitarian disaster. But I want to focus more on the strategic implications. First, I would say the fighting isn't necessarily over. Hamas, when it agreed to the ceasefire, and it was reluctant in part because it has leverage only when there's fighting. When there's no fighting, it has no leverage. It doesn't have anything to weigh in with other than fighting. And so in that sense, it resisted until it got some, what it thought were concessions, particularly in opening the passages to allow more goods and people to come into Gaza, and ultimately to renew negotiations within a month to open up the ports, possibly a Gaza seaport and also an airport to have more access to the outside world. It doesn't look like that's going to happen. And I suspect that in a couple of weeks, we're going to see a lot more tension building. And the possibility of renewing the violence is there. So it's not over, unfortunately. With all the damage and all the destruction, it's not over. Second, I don't think anybody says that Israel won this. In fact, more people say Israel lost. I happen to think that both sides lost. In fact, I tweeted early on in the conflict that the outcome was known ahead of time, and that is the outcome will be lose-lose with disproportionate casualties on the Palestinian side and no security for Israel. And clearly that's where we are right now. I think that even the Israeli public thinks that Israel didn't win the confrontation. And in some ways, the Israelis were very surprised because they always think, well, I'm going to do it better next time. Well, they tried it in 2006 with Hezbollah. Didn't work. Tried it in 2008 with Hamas. It apparently didn't work. Tried it again, and a couple of years later in 2012. Obviously, that didn't stop another round of fighting now. And every time there's a level of escalation that's unexpected. So yeah, the Israelis learned, but the Arabs learned too. And the best lesson to learn is this is not going to be resolved by military force, despite the asymmetry of power. And you have people who conclude that, but in the short term, of course, there is a hardening of positions. The second point I want to make is that one of the things that was disturbing about this war is not just, obviously, the death and destruction, which was hard to take, and anyone who cares. Didn't matter. You didn't have to be Arab or Jew to look at the level of destruction and be moved by it and wanting to do something about it. But put that aside, what we saw in this conflict is a kind of a new language of dehumanization. Now, conflict always has dehumanization. It's, in fact, built into conflict in some ways. People do it as a strategy to fight effectively. But we saw in the mainstream language that we hadn't seen before. including, and especially actually on the Israeli side, where you've had people from the mainstream or close to the mainstream who argued there's no such thing as civilian casualties. Now that's something that is very difficult to uphold in terms of international norms and international law. And I think what we're going to see, obviously, coming up in international institutions is an attempt to take the parties to task on violations of international law and possibly war crimes. And human rights organizations have leveled that against both sides in terms of violation of international law. We're going to see a lot more of that. Finally, I think neither side has a unilateral solution. That's very obvious. Hamas has proven that it can make the Israeli sense of security go away very rapidly, despite the weakness and limitations. And despite its overwhelming military superiority, Israel, after nearly 2 months of fighting, couldn't impose its will in such a relatively small area. And so clearly no one is going to be able to do that. But the Hamas also doesn't have, other than fighting or making it difficult for the Israel, it has no way of then gaining independence on its own. And so it still is a political solution that has to move us forward. The question is, how is this going to come about? And clearly, there's a sense that the leaderships of both sides has had its limits. American diplomacy has failed to persuade both sides to move, although Secretary of State Kerry has been very clear in blaming the Israeli settlement policy in the West Bank, even in the middle of negotiations, for most of the reason for the failure of the negotiations. And the Obama administration, which a lot of people have looked to try to mediate an end to the conflict, and to his credit, initially the president came to office thinking he was going to provide that leadership. He tried to provide that leadership, but so far that hasn't worked, and it leaves the administration scrambling to figure out what to do, knowing that there could be another explosion on the Israel-Palestine issue that could draw the United States. So they are trying to figure out whether the urgency that was created by the tragedy of the war can be turned into something diplomatic that they could put on the table, even as the administration is dealing with other priorities, including in the Middle East, particularly the war on ISIS that the president essentially has declared. So there is, if you look at analysts who follow the Middle East, including people like me, including ones who have been trying to find hope somewhere to move this forward, obviously they have been quite disappointed and quite depressed. It's very hard to find people who can find a silver lining to this war or to the situation as it now exists. But someone has to try. And I think that's where the U.S. is trying to figure out whether it's the right party to take the lead in moving this to a different place. So I'll end with that and open it for questions.
Great. Wonderful. So please chat in your questions via the chat function or the Q&A function, and we'll make sure to get those questions answered. And while we're waiting for those questions to pop up, my question, one of my many questions, but as you mentioned, there's so much going on right now in the Middle East, and people and countries are distracted with everything that's happening. Do you think that could be a benefit to the peace process? And since there's not, so much focus on that issue.
No, I actually don't. The reason for it is that you can, one can go both ways on it, because you can say that maybe the attention was just making people harden their position, and that's one argument sometimes that is made, with regard to the Israelis who ultimately will need the U.S. to play some kind of role in the region. But I think the reality of it is there is a political momentum that's taken the parties away from reconciliation and toward, even under the best of circumstances. One of the questions that people ask, is it really not too late for a two-state solution? And you can make the argument it's too late, and I'm one of the ones who have been supporting of this diplomacy toward a two-state, that I sometimes wonder whether I'm rationalizing at this point, whether we will even know when it stopped. And I have a feeling, I say this as an analyst, not as somebody who cares so much, but I look at it as somebody who analyzes history, and I say if 50 years from now, we look back at this period and say, well, there was no two-state solution, and at what point did the this option end? History. I would think that it would have ended many weeks before now, not now. So if you're starting with that sense, then what you are doing is, trying to figure out what else can you do to the extent that you believe there is a threat of possibility that you can still save the two-state solution, and in large part because no one else has a solution that is acceptable to both sides that you can envision. That you need to put that sense of urgency, because every day the politics are taking you somewhere else. It's a demonization politics, and then there's the expansion of settlements on the West Bank, and that expansion of settlements is making it nearly impossible to reverse. And so you have to have somebody weigh in with a sense of urgency. And I think the fact that everybody is distracted may be a problem, not a benefit.
Yeah. So this question from Grace Winslow is the U.S. really going to try and pressure Israel into concessions?
Well, this is always a really central question for everyone, in the sense that the United States is Israel's biggest supporter. In fact, from the Israeli point of view, there is no strategic priority higher than preserving the relationship with the United States. So in that sense, the U.S. has immense influence with Israel, and that immense influence certainly matters. Obviously, Israel is dependent not only on technological assistance, military assistance, but even more political assistance. There is the international community has been pretty much on the other side of the Israeli position on occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. It's illegal under international law. Had it not been for the U.S. and the threat of the U.S. veto at the UN, you could have had a different outcome at the UN. So the U.S. theoretically, yes, has what it does is very consequential. Having said this, I don't really see that possibility happening in American politics. I don't think that is something that you can count on happening. It's not realistic. It's unlikely to happen. Look at the congressional support in the middle of war that has been condemned across the board internationally. You had 100% of the Senate, signing a letter supportive of the Israeli position. You didn't have hardly any criticism within the American political mainstream, whether it was Republican or Democrat, even as American public opinion among Democrats in particular and independents in particular thought that the Israeli actions in Gaza were unjustified. So I don't really see it happening. And I think realistically what the U.S. tries to do is not to be, perfectly balanced in its approach. Frankly, the Arabs never believed the U.S. could be fully balanced. They just want a sense of fairness, where their interests are taken into account, and where the U.S. is engaged not just as a mediator weighing in on behalf of Israel, or even for humanitarian reasons weighing in slightly in favor of the Palestinians, but rather because the U.S. has its own strategic interests. And those strategic interests for the U.S. were seen to include a peaceful settlement of the Israel-Palestine question, because that, as long as that's unsettled, it complicates America's strategy, whether it's vis-a-vis Iran, or whether it is vis-a-vis ISIS, or whether it's vis-a-vis any number of issues. And so for that reason, people are hopeful that America's own national interests, America's interest in the Arab world, in addition to support for Israel, could be utilized in an effective way to move it forward and to nudge Israel more. That's the hope. Obviously, so far, it hasn't happened very effectively. And one example of this, of course, is in the first Obama administration, when the president initially declared that he was against any settlement building in Israel, any Israeli settlement building in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. And ultimately, the Israelis obviously didn't accept that and continued to build, and there was no consequence. So the fact is, there has not been consequence for going against America's recommendation. And can you then expect some change in behavior? And if the U.S. is going to provide some credible red lines, to both sides, to all parties, I'm not saying just to the Israelis, where's that going to come from? And that's been part of the problem, particularly with a distracted international system, with an ineffective UN structure, with Arabs themselves being divided and fighting their own battles internally. And that's one reason why we're in the mess that we're facing.
So